The evening of July 26, 1952, in Buenos Aires, the city fell into a hush that words can scarcely carry. Bells tolled across the neighborhoods, from the poorest streets to the grand avenues, and a weight hung in the air as though even the walls themselves held their breath. Argentina's beloved First Lady, Eva Perón, had drawn her final breath, her body succumbing to the unrelenting grasp of illness. She was only 33, yet already her figure belonged less to time and more to myth. That night, thousands wept openly, their tears mingling with candlelight, while others watched silently, suspicious or relieved. But her story did not end with death, for in the stillness of her departure began a stranger journey, one that would outlast her flesh. Dear listener, I welcome you into this long remembrance, spoken like a thread woven into the tapestry of time. Tell me, if you will, when and where you are listening, so that across oceans and years, we become companions in memory. And if you find meaning in these words, I invite you to subscribe, to let these voices of history travel further, sustained by your presence. It is here, at the very threshold of her passing, that our story opens. Picture the darkened sky above Buenos Aires, where lamplight flickered against balconies and the stillness of the streets carried the murmur of radios announcing her death. She was not an ordinary woman and not an ordinary death. She was Evita, a name sung in adoration, whispered in bitterness and carved into banners raised by the poor. To some, she was a saint, a mother to the dispossessed. To others, she was a dangerous enchantress who had bent a nation to her will. In this tension, her death carried not only sorrow, but also the raw tremor of power, as if one candle had been extinguished only for 1,000 shadows to stir. I imagine her final hours in that hospital room, its curtains drawn tight, the smell of medicines faint but lingering, the air heavy with both hope and dread. Outside, nurses and officials walked softly, their eyes lowered. Within, Juan Perón, her husband and president of Argentina, sat by her side. For months he had watched the vigor of her being diminish, her frame growing slight, her once bright eyes shadowed by exhaustion. She had held on for as long as she could, refusing to withdraw from public life, refusing to let illness define her. Yet in the end, the quiet hand of death touched her, and all resistance fell away. And so, in that moment, time faltered. The city, vast and restless, slowed its heartbeat. Radios interrupted their music, newspapers rushed to their presses, voices spread the word from window to window, street to street. Evita has died. 3 words, and yet they carried with them both reverence and division. What did it mean for Argentina, for Perón, for the millions who adored her, for the thousands who despised her? Some wept openly in the streets, women clutching photographs, men falling to their knees, candles lit in the dust of the sidewalks. Others kept their silence, closing their doors, whispering that the spell was broken, that perhaps now the country might breathe. There is a strange stillness when someone dies young, at the height of power and influence. Death at such an age unsettles us, as if the rhythm of nature has been disturbed. Had she lived to grow old, Evita might have mellowed into memory, her power softened into nostalgia. But to die at 33, was it not to be frozen in a perfection of image, forever luminous, forever untouchable? The body decays, but the myth endures, sealed in a youthful face. I wonder, dear listener, whether this is why she is not faded, why her figure still haunts Argentina and beyond. And yet her story does not simply rise into the realm of myth, for death is not always an end but a passage, and hers was a passage both dark and disturbing. Her body would not rest peacefully, as bodies are meant to do. It would be embalmed with unnatural care, preserved with almost ritual obsession, as though her presence were needed still among the living. And later, it would be stolen, hidden, desecrated, passed across countries like an object, a relic both revered and cursed. It is in this uneasy tale that we linger, and it begins here with the quiet of that hospital room where a young woman exhaled her last breath and a nation inhaled her memory. I picture again the city that night. Perhaps you too can see it. The lights along Avenida 9 de Julio glimmer faintly, the grand obelisk watching silently as if it too bore witness. From the working-class districts came the sound of footsteps gathering, people moving toward the center, carrying flowers, candles, portraits. Mothers held children by the hand, whispering, "She is gone, but she will always be with us." In their grief, there was devotion, as if she had been a mother to them all. Yet across other districts, shutters remained closed, conversations hushed behind walls, men whispering in the dark that the time of enchantment was finished. Even in death she divided. Even in death she reigned. And what of the man by her side, Juan Perón? For him, this was not only the loss of a wife, but of a partner whose presence magnified his power. He had leaned upon her charisma, her bond with the poor, her voice that carried further than any decree he might sign. In her absence, the weight of leadership would sit heavier, less certain, less beloved. Did he already sense the shifting of tides? Or was his grief too deep, his gaze fixed only on the still figure beside him? No one could know, for grief is silent and power is cunning, and often the two blend in ways unseen. The hours after her death unfolded like a ritual. Her body was prepared, her passing announced, and soon the city was swept into mourning. Yet this was no ordinary mourning, for her death was not a private loss, but a national wound. Portraits of Evita appeared draped in black. Radio announcers spoke through tears, and the air grew thick with flowers. There is a certain fragrance to grief when expressed with such abundance, petals wilting under the sun, incense burning, the faint sting of salt tears. Even those who had opposed her felt the weight of the moment, for the death of such a figure is like the fall of a great tree. Whether one loved it or not, its absence changes the landscape. But let us pause here, dear listener, in this moment of her final breath, her final silence, and the hush that spread across Argentina. Let us linger in this stillness, as though time itself has bent, for it is in the stillness that memory takes shape, in the silence that echoes endure. The bells are tolling still in the distance, their sound fading into the night, and the air holds an emptiness that no words can fill. Do you hear it too, even across the distance of years? That hush, that trembling silence. Perhaps it is the same silence that surrounds us whenever we speak of the dead. And so we end this first passage, with time itself hesitating, caught between a final exhale and the gathering of shadows that would follow. Her body lies still, her eyes closed, and yet already her story has begun to travel. For though Eva Perón is gone, Evita remains. The stillness of her final breath lingers, as though the room itself has grown heavier with silence. And from that silence we step backward into another place, another time, where the air was not heavy with illness, but with dust and the scent of earth. Long before Buenos Aires, before the grand avenues and the sea of faces who would one day chant her name, there was Los Toldos, a small settlement in the Pampas, where the land stretched wide and the sky seemed endless. Here Eva Maria Duarte, later known as Eva Perón, began her life on May 7, 1919, as the youngest of 5 children. The house was modest, almost fragile, the kind of place where walls carried the chill of winter and the heat of summer without mercy. It was not a home of abundance, but one of survival, where small comforts meant everything. Her father, Juan Duarte, was a man of contradictions. Though he had land and recognition elsewhere, his relationship with Eva's mother, Juana Ibarguren, placed the family in a shadow of illegitimacy. When Duarte eventually left, returning to his other life, Eva and her siblings grew under the weight of absence, their mother shouldering the burden of providing. I imagine the sound of Juana's hands at work, the roughness of fabric as she sewed to earn their living, the resilience in her silence. For Eva, the memory of her father was faint, almost like a ghost glimpsed at a distance, and perhaps this absence carved in her an early hunger, a yearning to be seen, to be acknowledged, to rise above the quiet neglect of poverty. The pampas are vast, dear listener. If you close your eyes, you might see them. The endless fields stretching to the horizon, the whisper of grasses bending under the wind, the distant sound of a train's whistle echoing across the plain. In such a place, life was measured not by grandeur, but by endurance. Days were marked by the labor of hands, the patience of waiting for rains, the resilience to face scarcity. Children grew with dust on their feet, their games mingling with chores, their dreams carried by the rare sight of newspapers or traveling stories. For little Eva, the horizon itself was a promise, a line that always seemed to call her forward. Did she already sense, even as a girl, that she was not meant to remain there, hidden in the folds of obscurity? Her childhood was not gentle, yet it was formative. Teachers recalled her as spirited, restless, with a sharp awareness beyond her years. She listened to the radio when she could, captivated by voices from faraway places, by singers and actresses who seemed to live in another world altogether. To a girl in Los Toldos, such voices were not merely entertainment. They were glimpses into another existence, a place where one could be admired, remembered, celebrated. The soil of her early life was poor, but from it grew a determination as fierce as it was quiet. I often wonder what it feels like to grow up with both the weight of poverty and the whisper of ambition. Does it sharpen the senses, making one notice every slight, every chance for escape? Does it carve a hunger deeper than any comfort can fill? Eva's later life suggests so, for she pursued recognition with a fire that never dimmed, as though every act of indifference she endured in childhood became a spark for her ascent. And yet, even in her later power, the shadow of Los Toldos never fully left her. She carried with her the memory of want, and in that memory, she found a bond with the poor, a bond that would shape her destiny. There are stories, passed through recollection, of Eva walking the dirt paths, barefoot, her clothes modest, her hair unremarkable. She was not yet the glamorous figure with carefully styled curls and tailored dresses, but a child of the pampas, eyes sharp, voice insistent. And though neighbors might not have imagined her future, within her stirred the disquiet of one who longs for elsewhere. Her brothers and sisters, too, bore the weight of circumstance, but Eva's gaze was always on the horizon. The train station became, for her, a place of wonder. Each departing whistle seemed to carry with it possibility, a promise that life could unfold differently if only one dared to follow. Her relationship with her mother was one of resilience. Juana, though burdened, instilled in her children the will to endure. But she also knew the harshness of society, how whispers of illegitimacy and poverty could stain a name. Perhaps she told Eva in quiet moments that to be recognized, one must be stronger than judgment, louder than silence. For a girl listening to the radio at night, hearing the voices of actresses who were adored, these words might have planted seeds that later grew into relentless determination. The pampas at night carried a different kind of silence than the one we spoke of in Buenos Aires. Here the silence was vast, filled with the hum of insects, the cry of distant animals, the sweep of the wind across grass. Under that endless sky, Eva must have looked up and wondered what lay beyond. Stars burned above her, indifferent yet guiding, and in that infinite map she may have found both insignificance and possibility. Such nights shape the soul, dear listener, for they remind us that we are small, and yet that within us burns a desire to reach beyond. It is said that by her teenage years, Eva was already restless, her heart pulled toward Buenos Aires. The city, with its theaters, its lights, its promise of escape, was as distant as the moon, and yet not unreachable. Many might have resigned themselves to life in Los Toldos, accepting the dust, the scarcity, the narrow paths laid out before them, but Eva was not one to resign. She was like a bird restless in a cage, her wings itching for flight. And so she began to dream of leaving, of finding her place among the voices that once reached her through the static of the radio. But before that departure, there were years marked by the weight of family duty, by the whispers of neighbors, by the quiet persistence of her mother's labor. These years carved into her not only ambition, but also defiance. When she was slighted for her origins, she remembered. When she was told what she could not be, she listened and stored the words like kindling for a fire she would later ignite. The child who walked barefoot in Los Toldos would one day stand in jewels before multitudes, and yet within her, the dust of the pampas would remain, both as a wound and as a bond. As we linger here in her childhood, the sound of that train whistle grows louder in our minds. It is not yet the train she will board, but it is always there, calling her toward the horizon. The dust settles, the night deepens, and the girl stands still for a moment, gazing into the distance. What is she waiting for? Perhaps the chance to escape, perhaps the chance to be more than forgotten. The image remains unresolved, a child standing at the edge of fields, her eyes fixed on the faraway line where earth meets sky, listening for the sound of departure. The train whistle lingers in the air, echoing across the flat fields of the pampas. And in that echo, we see the young Eva Duarte standing at the edge of departure. Dust clings to her shoes, her eyes fixed on the rails that vanish into the horizon, and with a sudden courage that often belongs only to youth, she chooses to follow. It was 1934, and she was just 15 when she left Los Toldos behind. Some say she persuaded, others say she begged, and others whisper she simply demanded. But whichever the truth, she boarded a train bound for Buenos Aires, carrying with her little more than determination and a few belongings. To some, it seemed an act of foolishness, to trust so much to chance, but to Eva, it was the only act possible. Buenos Aires in the 1930s was a city of contradictions, alive with music and shadow. The tango drifted through tavern doors, radios carried the voices of singers across rooftops, theaters pulsed with light, yet the poor lived in crowded barrios where survival was uncertain. To step off the train into this chaos was to be swallowed by noise, scent, and movement unlike anything she had known in Los Toldos. Imagine the young girl, thin, unremarkable by the standards of beauty magazines, standing on a crowded platform, her heart pounding as carriages rattled, vendors shouted, and the city opened itself with both invitation and indifference. At first she struggled. Work was scarce, and for a girl with no connections, no wealth, and no name, the path was hard. Some stories tell of her working as a seamstress, echoing her mother's labor, stitching fabric while her thoughts lingered on stages she longed to walk. Others recall her knocking on theater doors, offering herself for minor roles, waiting in the long corridors of casting offices where the faces of hopefuls blurred into anonymity. She was not yet Evita, not yet the shining figure adored by crowds, but simply Eva, a girl who refused to return home. The city was not kind. Landlords demanded rent, theaters rejected her, and hunger often gnawed at her persistence. Yet there is something about the resilience of those who cannot afford to surrender. Each failure became fuel, each closed door a reason to search for another. She moved through the city with an almost desperate hunger, her eyes set not on comfort, but on the fragile promise of recognition. And in time, small roles began to come, faint flickers of light in an otherwise dim corridor. Radio was the beginning of her true ascent. It was the medium she had once listened to in Los Toldos, and now it became the place where her own voice carried. In the late 1930s, she began working as an actress in radio dramas, lending her voice to stories of heroines and saints, often playing roles of women who endured suffering yet triumphed through devotion. The irony is striking. Even before she stepped into the political stage, her voice had already been shaping her into a figure of myth, a symbol of struggle and resilience that audiences admired. Buenos Aires, however, never ceased to test her. The city's glamour was built upon inequality, and the distance between those who danced in glittering halls and those who worked in silence was vast. Eva saw this distance, felt it, perhaps more keenly because she had lived its harsher side. She did not forget the dust of Los Toldos, the whispers of illegitimacy, the absence of her father's name. And so, while she pursued recognition, she also carried within her the weight of resentment, a flame of defiance that would later define her. In these years, she learned much, not only how to survive, but how to present herself, how to shape her own image. She learned that the stage required more than talent. It required presence, the ability to command attention, to draw eyes, to hold voices in silence. She studied the actresses who were admired, the way they walked, the way they dressed, the cadence of their speech. Slowly, she began to refine herself, not merely as an actress, but as a persona. Perhaps it was here that Eva Duarte first began to dissolve into Evita, the creation who would one day stand above crowds like a vision. And yet, the struggle never fully vanished. There were rumors, unkind whispers, of how she navigated the city, of the compromises she may or may not have made to secure roles, to pay rent, to survive. Some called her ambitious, others opportunistic. But is ambition not often misunderstood by those who never knew hunger? We cannot say with certainty which stories are truth and which are invention, for her life was always wrapped in legend, even before she rose to power. What we know is that she remained, she endured, and she climbed, step by step, toward the stage that awaited her. The theaters of Buenos Aires were intoxicating. Imagine their velvet curtains, their gilded balconies, the hum of anticipation before a performance. For a girl from Los Toldos, these spaces were both alien and magnetic. She may have stood at the edge of the stage before her performance, listening to the murmur of the audience, feeling her own heartbeat echo in her chest. For a moment, she was no longer the child of poverty, no longer the girl whispered about for her origins, but an actress, a figure of light, receiving the gaze of strangers. Recognition, even in small doses, is a powerful sustenance. The late 1930s carried her further into visibility. She began to appear in films, though often in minor roles, her face glimpsed rather than remembered. Still, each role was another step, another proof that she could not be erased. Yet beyond the theater and radio, the city itself shaped her. Buenos Aires was a place of constant movement, of politics and passion, of unions and workers demanding justice, of elites guarding their privileges. Eva walked its streets, breathed its air, and slowly absorbed its tensions. The voices of the poor were voices she understood. The indifference of the powerful was something she had long known. There is a kind of alchemy in these years, when a life shifts from obscurity to significance. We cannot point to one single moment, one performance, one decision that changed everything. Rather, it was a gathering of fragments, the courage of leaving Los Toldos, the persistence of surviving in Buenos Aires, the voice carried over radio waves, the gaze of audiences in dim theaters. Piece by piece, Eva Duarte was shaping herself into something larger, though she could not yet know how far the shaping would carry her. And so, as the lights of Buenos Aires flickered in the night, Eva walked among them, sometimes unnoticed, sometimes admired, always striving. The sound of the city at night, the rattle of trams, the laughter spilling from cafes, the melancholy of tango drifting from open windows, wrapped around her as she moved through streets that were both cruel and promising. She was still young, still fragile in many ways, but within her burned the determination of one who would not return to dust. We end this passage, dear listener, with the image of theater lights flickering. The audience departs, the curtains close, the sound of footsteps fades into the night. Eva remains, standing in the dimness of the empty stage, her eyes reflecting the glow of the last lights. The performance is over, yet her story has only just begun. The flicker of theater lights fades into darkness, leaving Eva Duarte standing in the dim glow of a nearly empty hall, her breath still quick from performance, her mind restless with thoughts of tomorrow. In that twilight between applause and silence, destiny was already bending its path toward her, though she could not yet see it. For beyond the curtain and beyond the small stages of Buenos Aires, there waited a figure who would alter the course of her life and the life of an entire nation. His name was Juan Domingo Perón. The year was 1944, and Argentina, like much of the world, trembled in the shadow of war abroad and uncertainty at home. Buenos Aires was alive with political murmurs, the language of rallies and unions, the tension between the old elites and the rising voices of workers. Juan Perón, then a rising military officer and Secretary of Labor, had begun to draw notice with his unusual sympathy toward the working class. He was not yet the president, not yet the towering figure of Argentine politics, but already he carried an air of command, a presence that drew others into his orbit. The two met on an evening heavy with sorrow and yet filled with music. An earthquake had devastated the city of San Juan, leaving thousands dead and wounded, and Buenos Aires gathered to raise aid through a charity gala at the Luna Park Stadium. The hall was filled with figures from the worlds of art, politics, and entertainment, their laughter mingled with the solemnity of the cause. Eva was there as an actress, her presence part of the constellation of performers offering their names and talents to the relief effort. Perón was there as the statesman, the officer-turned-labor advocate, speaking for the suffering and rallying the nation to compassion. It is said their eyes met in that hall, amid the noise of conversation and the music of orchestras. Some recount that she approached him with boldness, introducing herself, offering her admiration for his work. Others say it was he who noticed her, drawn to the sharpness of her gaze, the force beneath her youthful beauty. However the moment unfolded, it carried with it a spark that would not be extinguished. Within hours, Eva Duarte and Juan Perón were inseparable, their fates entwined by ambition, affection, and the inexorable pull of power. To imagine their early days together is to imagine two lives converging not merely in affection, but in a shared hunger for ascent. Eva saw in Perón not only a man of influence, but a vessel through which her own dreams might expand beyond the stage. Perón, in turn, saw in Eva not only beauty, but a voice capable of reaching the masses, a companion whose passion matched his own vision. She brought with her the devotion of the descamisados, the shirtless poor, because she spoke their language, carried their wounds, remembered their hunger. He brought the machinery of politics, the discipline of the military, the strategy of power. Together, they became something more than individuals. They became a union of myth and strategy, of fire and steel. Their courtship was swift, almost impatient, as though both knew that time could not be wasted. Within a year, she had moved into his home, a scandal to some, a whispering point for many. Newspapers carried both admiration and derision, for Eva was still considered a woman of humble origin, a radio actress of no great repute, unworthy in the eyes of the elite to stand beside a man rising toward the presidency. Yet it was precisely this union that unsettled the order of things, for it bound Perón to the people in a way no political alliance could have done. By taking Eva's hand, he took the hand of the poor, the working class, the voiceless, who had longed for recognition. The Knights of Buenos Aires must have felt different then. Imagine them together, walking under the street lamps, their voices low, their plans unfolding in whispers. Perhaps she spoke of her childhood, of her mother's labor, of the whispers of shame that haunted her youth. Perhaps he listened, nodding, recognizing in her pain a strength that could be harnessed. Their intimacy was not only personal, but also political, a weaving together of stories that would become the fabric of Argentina's future. For Eva, love and ambition were never separate. She adored Perón, yet she also saw him as the mirror through which her own destiny could be magnified. She was not content to remain in the shadows of his power. She insisted on stepping alongside him, her voice rising with his. When he addressed workers, she was there. When he strategized his next move, she listened. And slowly, her presence became inseparable from his image. The people began to chant her name as well as his, their voices fusing the two into a single cry, Perón y Evita. The elite sneered. They called her an opportunist, an actress playing a role beyond her station. They whispered about her past, about the men she had known, about the impropriety of her sudden rise. But their scorn only fueled her. She remembered every insult, every dismissal, and she transformed them into fire. She would not retreat. She would not be erased. If they sought to shame her, she would stand taller. If they sought to silence her, she would speak louder. It was a defiance rooted not only in ambition but in survival, the same defiance that had carried her from Los Toldos to Buenos Aires, from hunger to recognition. And so, by 1945, as Perón's star rose ever higher, Eva's presence became undeniable. She stood beside him during rallies, her slender figure radiant in carefully chosen gowns, her voice fierce as she spoke of the poor, of justice, of dignity for those long ignored. For the descamisados, she was not merely the wife of a leader. She was one of them, a daughter of poverty who had ascended yet had not forgotten. To see her at Perón's side was to see themselves lifted, acknowledged, honored. There is an image often recalled from these days, the two of them standing together before a sea of faces, hands clasped, the roar of the crowd rising around them. Perón speaks, his tone measured, commanding, while beside him Eva's eyes blaze with conviction. The banners wave, the chants grow louder, and in that moment it is clear that theirs is no ordinary partnership. It is a convergence of fate, a fusion that will alter not only their own lives, but the destiny of Argentina itself. Yet even as their love deepened and their political power solidified, shadows gathered. For every cheer that rose in her name, there was a whisper of envy, of hatred, of fear. The elites plotted. The military watched, and Eva herself carried within her the knowledge that adoration and condemnation often walk side by side. She had clasped Perón's hand, and with it she had entered the heart of power. But power is never without its price. And so we end this passage with their clasped hands, raised above the crowd, bound together by love and ambition, surrounded by chants that shook the very air of Buenos Aires. The sound echoes still, swelling, rising, fading, leaving us with the image of two figures standing firm before a sea of devotion, unaware of the storms yet to come. The sound of chant still lingers in the air, swelling and fading like waves against stone, and within that rhythm we see the figures of Juan Perón and Eva Duarte standing together, their hands clasped, their faces lit by the fervor of the crowd. From that moment onward, Eva was no longer only an actress, no longer only a companion. She was becoming Evita, the First Lady in spirit before she was so in title, a presence inseparable from the destiny of Argentina. When Perón rose to the presidency in 1946, carried by the devotion of the descamisados and the strength of his labor movement, Eva rose beside him, radiant and unyielding. To imagine her voice in those days is to hear something more than words. She spoke with urgency, her tone sharp and alive, each syllable striking like a bell. Crowds filled the plazas to hear her, men and women who had long felt invisible, now seeing in her their reflection. She did not speak as the elite spoke, with polished distance, but as one who had known hunger, humiliation, and neglect. She promised dignity, justice, a place in the sun for the poor. And the poor believed, because she herself was proof that such a rise was possible. From the balcony of the Casa Rosada, she looked out upon multitudes, their chants of Evita, Evita rising like prayer. Imagine that sight, a sea of faces, arms lifted, banners swaying in the wind, the air thick with devotion. She raised her hand, slender yet commanding, and the sound of the crowd shifted into silence, a silence filled with expectancy. Her voice carried across the square, weaving promises, pledges, assurances that they were not forgotten. For those moments, she was not merely a politician's wife, but a prophet of the poor, her words echoing with almost sacred intensity. Yet with every cheer came whispers. The aristocracy, the old elite of Argentina, looked upon her with disdain. To them, she was an interloper, an actress who had dared step into the palace, a woman of no name who now carried herself with the bearing of royalty. They ridiculed her dresses, her jewels, her rhetoric. They scorned her devotion to the poor as manipulation, her public appearances as mere theater. But their hatred only seemed to strengthen her resolve. She remembered Los Toldos, the dust, the hunger, the shame. She would not bow to them. Instead, she would use her position to elevate those they dismissed. It was during these years that she began her vast charitable works, channeled through the Eva Peron Foundation. Hospitals were built, schools established, homes constructed for children and for the elderly. Clothes and toys were distributed, scholarships granted, medicines supplied to those who could never have afforded them. Her office was crowded each morning with petitioners, women clutching infants, workers with worn hands, the sick, the elderly, all seeking her help. And she received them, listening, granting favors, writing notes, dispatching aid. To them, she was not a distant First Lady, but a living benefactress, the embodiment of compassion itself. Yet even here, shadows lingered. Was it pure compassion, or was it also a careful shaping of power? Did she give because she remembered poverty, or because she wished to bind the poor forever to the Peronist cause? Perhaps both are true, and perhaps it does not matter. What matters is that the poor adored her. They wept when they saw her. They carried her portrait in their homes. They chanted her name as if invoking a saint. For Juan Perón, her role was invaluable. She extended his reach, transformed his policies into personal devotion, gave a face and a voice to his movement that no decree could achieve. And yet, her power was not entirely his. It grew beyond him, independent, rooted in her unique connection with the masses. At times, one suspects, it even unsettled him. The chants of Evita were not always followed by Perón. She was becoming something more than his consort, something he could not entirely contain. Her style became part of her legend. She dressed with meticulous care, her gowns elegant, her jewels striking, her hair coiffed into the signature style that became almost emblematic of her presence. To the poor, her splendor was not an offense but a symbol, one of their own, once barefoot in the pampas, now radiant before the world, proof that they too could rise. To the elite, her splendor was a provocation, a reminder that their monopoly on elegance had been broken, And so every pearl she wore, every gown she displayed, was both an adornment and a declaration of defiance. There is an image that remains etched in memory. Eva leaning forward over the balcony, her hands gripping the stone, her voice fierce as she spoke of workers' rights, of justice, of dignity. The crowd below responded with chants that shook the very air. The elite dismissed her words as theater, but for those who listened, they were life itself. She was their champion, their saint, their Evita. And yet beneath the glory there was strain. Her health, though not yet faltering openly, carried the wear of relentless effort. Her schedule was merciless, her days filled with audiences, speeches, appearances, her nights often consumed with planning and reflection. She pushed herself beyond limits, as if aware that time might not grant her abundance. There was something in the way she lived, a sense of haste, of urgency, as though she knew that her light would not burn long, and so it must burn intensely. But we are not yet at her decline. Here, in these years, her power reached its height. The poor adored her. The elites despised her, and Argentina itself seemed caught between devotion and division. She was a figure who illuminated and unsettled, who gave with one hand and provoked with the other, who rose above her beginnings only to carry them forever within her. Let us pause for a moment to imagine the sound of those crowds once more, filling the Plaza de Mayo, their chants rising like a tide, their voices echoing against the walls of the Casa Rosada. The banners wave, the drums beat, the chants of Evita, Evita swell and fade, and then, as the day gives way to evening, the sound softens, dissolving into whispers carried by the wind, whispers of envy, whispers of fear, whispers of hatred. Even in the midst of adoration, there were shadows forming, shadows that would grow darker as her star burned brighter. And so we close this passage with those whispers, faint yet persistent, curling around the sound of the crowds. The cheering has faded, replaced by murmurs in dim corridors, by voices speaking her name not in devotion but in suspicion. And for every chant that raised her higher, another voice conspired to pull her down. The whispers linger like smoke in darkened rooms, curling around the cheers that had filled the Plaza de Mayo only hours before. Whispers spoken not by the poor who adored her, but by the powerful who feared her. In salons lit by crystal lamps, in private clubs where cigars smoldered and glasses of wine stood half-finished, the name Evita was spoken with disdain. They said it softly, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with bitterness, always with unease. For her brightness unsettled them, her defiance was intolerable, and the shadows beneath her radiance grew thicker with every day she stood at Juan Perón's side. The elites of Argentina, long accustomed to ruling quietly over the destinies of others, saw in her not a first lady, not a charitable figure, but a dangerous force, a woman who dared to transgress the invisible boundaries of class and gender. She was not content to remain a silent partner, adorned and obedient. Instead, she had become a voice in her own right, and worse still, she had bound that voice to the people they most despised, the shirtless poor, the workers who demanded dignity, the women who sought recognition. To them, she was an actress still, playing a role upon the national stage, weaving illusions for the masses. But deep within, they knew she was something more, something harder to dismiss. In parliament, in military offices, in whispers among diplomats, her influence was considered excessive, unnatural. They said Perón himself was under her spell, that she whispered into his ear not words of love, but of policy, of strategy, of vengeance. Some accused her of poisoning his mind with ideas that threatened the established order. Others spoke of her as a dangerous enchantress, a modern Circe leading the nation astray. Their hatred was not only political, it was personal. It was the hatred of those who could not bear to see one who had begun in obscurity, in poverty, now walk among them as an equal, or worse, as their superior. And yet, the poor adored her. Their devotion was not diminished by the whispers of the elite. If anything, it deepened. For in every insult hurled at Evita by the powerful, the poor recognized themselves. When the elite sneered at her illegitimacy, at her humble origins, at her boldness, the poor heard the same sneers that had been directed at them for generations. To defend Evita was to defend themselves, and so their bond with her grew stronger, more unshakable. This duality defined her years as First Lady. Adored and reviled, elevated and despised, radiant and shadowed. She walked a path lit by devotion but haunted by malice, and perhaps she knew it. Perhaps she felt the weight of their hatred as tangibly as the flowers laid at her feet by those who loved her. To be a figure of myth is to be both illuminated and hunted. Consider the image of her stepping from the presidential car onto the steps of a hospital, her gown brushing against the stone, her hand raised in greeting. Around her gather nurses, patients, children carrying flowers. To them, she is hope, a promise made flesh. But in another part of the city, behind closed doors, the same moment is mocked, dismissed as theater, ridiculed as vanity. Two visions of the same woman, one holy, one profane. And within this tension, Evita herself walked, neither entirely saint nor entirely strategist, but always both at once. Her speeches during these years carried sharper edges. She spoke not only of compassion, but of vengeance, of the dangers posed by those who had long oppressed the poor. She began to name the oligarchs, the privileged, the enemies of the people, calling upon her followers to remain vigilant. To her supporters, this was righteous fury, a cleansing flame. To her enemies, it was dangerous demagoguery. Every word she spoke drew adoration from some and hatred from others, the gap widening until it seemed she existed only in extremes, loved or loathed, never simply regarded. It is worth asking, dear listener, did she embrace this division, or did it weigh upon her? Was she hardened by the hatred, or wounded by it in secret? We cannot know. Her public face was always defiant, her gaze unflinching, her words sharp. Yet behind the closed doors of the palace, did she ever weep for the cruelty of the whispers, for the contempt she could never escape? Or did she transform even her private pain into fuel, another reason to fight? Perhaps both truths exist, folded together, as complex as the woman herself. In 1947, she traveled to Europe, a grand tour that revealed the extent of her transformation. To some, she was a symbol of Argentina's modern strength, radiant in Dior gowns, welcomed in Spain, greeted with curiosity in Italy, scrutinized in France. To others, especially among European elites, she was regarded with suspicion, a parvenu cloaked in luxury, a reminder that the boundaries of class could be transgressed. She carried with her the voice of Argentina's poor, yet walked among kings and presidents, a contradiction that unsettled as much as it fascinated. The poor of Buenos Aires followed her journey in newspapers and radio broadcasts with pride, while the elites muttered that she embarrassed the nation. Once again, devotion and disdain traveled side by side, never to be separated. Upon her return, her influence had grown. She was no longer merely the wife of the president. She had become a figure unto herself, a power that could not be ignored. The descamisados adored her with an intensity that bordered on worship, and they demanded more of her, more appearances, more words, more promises. She gave herself to them with unrelenting energy, pouring her body and voice into service. Yet every act of giving only sharpened the hatred of those who could not accept her presence. And so the whispers grew louder, the shadows darker. There is an image that captures the essence of this time, a single candle burning brightly, its flame sharp, its light casting both illumination and shadow. The brighter the flame, the deeper the shadow falls. Evita was that flame, burning with fierce brilliance, warming the poor, unsettling the powerful. But every flame consumes itself, and already, unseen, her body was beginning to feel the cost. Let us end here, dear listener, with the candle's flame flickering. Its light falls across faces both adoring and resentful, casting long shadows into the corners of rooms where whispers conspire. The wax runs slowly, the flame burns steadily, and yet we cannot help but wonder how long it can endure. The candle's flame flickers in the dimness, casting its light upon the faces of those who watch with devotion, while in the shadows, others whisper with suspicion. From this flame we move into the heart of Evita's daily labors, the work that would bind her forever to the memory of the poor, and yet also deepen the doubts of her enemies. For she was not content merely to stand upon balconies and speak. She sought to place her hands, her name, and her presence into the very fabric of the people's lives. And so the Eva Peron Foundation was born, a vast web of giving that spread across Argentina like a new river, carrying with it hospitals, schools, orphanages, and homes. Each morning, crowds gathered outside her offices, waiting with patience, with desperation, with faith. Mothers carried children with fevers. Workers came with petitions written on scraps of paper. The elderly leaned on canes, their eyes filled with quiet hope. They came because they believed she would listen, and she did. Eva sat behind her desk, her figure elegant yet firm, receiving them one by one, hearing their stories, granting favors. Sometimes she wrote notes on the spot, dispatching aides to deliver medicines, to arrange jobs, to grant scholarships. Other times she promised more than she could give, and yet the promise itself felt like a gift, a recognition of dignity. For those who had known only indifference from the state, to be acknowledged by Evita was to be seen at last. The hospitals she built carried her name, her presence lingering in their corridors like a guardian. Children in orphanages clutched dolls stamped with her likeness. School children received shoes and uniforms gifted by her hand. There is a sweetness in these images, children's laughter mingling with the scent of new clothes, the echo of footsteps in freshly built schools. But there is also an unease, for the line between charity and power is always delicate. Were these gifts pure compassion, or were they instruments of loyalty? Did she give because she remembered the sting of poverty, or because she wished to bind the poor in gratitude to Peronism forever? Perhaps both are true. Perhaps compassion and power are never entirely separate, but woven together like threads in a single cloth. She remembered her own hunger, the shame of illegitimacy, the absence of her father, the struggle of her mother. These memories burned in her still, and when she gave fiercely, almost obsessively, as if each act of generosity was also an act of vengeance against the past. Yet at the same time, she understood the theater of politics, the way gifts could be symbols as much as sustenance. A pair of shoes was not only leather and stitching, it was a declaration that the poor mattered, that Evita had remembered them. And in that remembrance, loyalty was born. Her enemies, of course, saw only vanity. They said the foundation was propaganda, a grand stage upon which she played the role of saint. They ridiculed the dolls, the uniforms, the photographs of her distributing gifts, dismissing them as calculated gestures. They whispered that the money was taken from unions, coerced from businesses, diverted from the state. Perhaps some of this was true, perhaps some of it invention. What matters is that for the poor, these accusations meant little. What mattered was that their children wore shoes, that their sick found medicine, that someone in the Casa Rosada cared enough to listen. Consider the image of her in one of her hospitals, walking the corridor, her gown trailing softly across the tiles, nurses pausing to bow their heads as she passed. She enters a ward of children, their eyes wide, their faces pale with illness. She bends low to kiss a child's forehead, to stroke a hand, to whisper words of comfort. Cameras may capture the moment, journalists may write of it, but for the child, for the mother watching, the moment is not theater, but reality. In that touch, in that gaze, Evita became more than a figure of power. She became a presence of solace. Yet how fragile such moments are. Laughter in a children's ward can echo like music, but it can also fade into silence when the illness is grave, when the medicine is not enough, when the body fails despite care. And in those silences, suspicion creeps. Was her giving enough? Was it sustainable? Could one woman, however powerful, truly erase the deep wounds of inequality with gifts and foundations? Perhaps not. Perhaps her giving was more symbolic than systemic, more balm than cure. But perhaps symbols matter more than cures in the lives of those who have known only neglect. She worked tirelessly, often to the point of exhaustion. Visitors remarked upon her intensity, her refusal to rest, her insistence on meeting endless petitioners. It was as though she carried within her the urgency of someone who sensed that time was short, that her candle would not burn long. Her own body, already betraying her in small ways, felt the strain, but she pressed on, unwilling to yield. To the poor, her exhaustion was invisible. They saw only her devotion. To the elite, it was a performance, a manipulation. Between these two visions, the truth of her labor may lie hidden, like a coin that glitters differently depending on the angle of light. And yet the image that endures is not of suspicion but of devotion. The poor remembered her visits, her gifts, her words. They remembered her face leaning close, her hand reaching out, her eyes that seemed to carry both sorrow and fire. They remembered that she did not speak down to them, but to them as one of their own. And for this, they loved her beyond reason, beyond politics, beyond life itself. As we linger in this passage, dear listener, let us pause in the quiet of one of her hospitals at night. The corridors are dim, the scent of disinfectant hangs in the air, and the sound of children's laughter heard in the day has now dissolved into silence. Nurses move softly, their footsteps faint, their voices hushed. In the stillness, the hospital seems both sanctuary and tomb, filled with hope, and yet haunted by suffering. The laughter lingers in memory, but in reality, there's only the sterile hum of silence. And within that silence lies the question, can even the brightest flame truly banish the darkness? The sterile silence of the hospital ward lingers, the hum of lamps faint, the air heavy with both hope and sorrow. And into that silence comes the first hidden shadow upon Evita herself. For though she walked among the sick and the poor with energy and devotion, her own body had begun to whisper of frailty. At first it was scarcely noticed, a cough concealed behind a smile, a sudden wince smoothed over by composure, a moment's weariness brushed away with determination. To the crowds, she remained radiant, tireless, untouchable. But beneath the layers of silk and jewels, beneath the strength of her voice, her body was beginning to falter. It was the early 1950s, and she was still young, only in her early 30s, at the height of her power and adoration. Yet in quiet moments, away from the balconies and the cameras, there were signs that could no longer be ignored. Pain that lingered, fatigue that grew heavier, fevers that came unbidden. Her physicians, discreet and cautious, began to whisper words that were difficult even to speak. Carcinoma, cervical cancer, an illness both relentless and cruel. But Eva, ever defiant, refused to let the word define her. To admit weakness was to grant victory to her enemies, and so she pressed on, demanding more of her body than it could bear. Her public appearances during these years carried a strange tension, a duality of strength and fragility. Imagine her standing before the crowds, her figure slender, almost spectral in its delicacy, yet her voice ringing with fire. To those who adored her, the very contrast seemed miraculous. How could such a frail body hold such force? It was as though her spirit burned more fiercely as her flesh weakened, a flame consuming itself in order to shine. Some whispered that she was sustained not by health, but by sheer will, by a determination so fierce it defied mortality itself. Juan Perón, too, must have seen the change. He had relied upon her strength, upon the fervor she stirred among the masses, and now he watched as illness gnawed at her. Did he feel helpless, watching the woman who had lifted him falter? Or did he, too, conceal his fear behind politics, unable to show the depth of his concern? Accounts suggest he was both caring and pragmatic, arranging the best physicians, shielding her when he could, yet also using her image, her presence, as long as she was able to stand beside him. For her image had become essential to his power, and she, despite her pain, gave herself to that role with unrelenting devotion. She continued to receive the poor even as her body weakened. Visitors to her office remarked that she seemed thinner, her skin paler, her movements more deliberate. Yet she would not turn them away. She listened, she granted, she comforted, even when she herself needed comfort. It is a strange and poignant image, a woman slowly consumed by illness, still extending her hands to others, still pouring out energy she no longer possessed. For the poor, her endurance was proof of her sanctity, a sacrifice offered for their sake. For her enemies, her waning body was evidence of her mortality, the inevitable end of the myth they despised. The press, carefully managed, rarely acknowledged her illness openly. To admit frailty was to risk undermining the image of strength she projected. But rumors spread nonetheless, carried in whispers through Buenos Aires, in reports abroad, in the eyes of those who saw her with their own gaze. Some pitied, some gloated, some wondered how long she could endure. And she, sensing all this, only pressed harder, as if to outpace the approach of death. There is an image, seared into memory, of Evita in these final years, her figure draped in white, her face serene yet distant, her hand lifted in blessing as though she were already something more than mortal. Crowds wept when they saw her, not only out of devotion but out of sorrow, for they sensed that she was slipping away even as she stood before them. The contradiction was painful to witness, a woman at the peak of her symbolic power, yet physically frail, her vitality ebbing day by day. I often wonder, dear listener, whether she knew the truth of her illness in its fullness. Did her physicians soften their words, hoping to shield her? Did she herself refuse to ask, preferring instead to live in defiance rather than submission? Or did she know all along and simply choose to fight against it with every breath she had left? Perhaps the answer lies in the way she carried herself, not as one resigned, but as one determined to make her final years blaze so brightly that time itself would remember. Her decline did not silence her. On the contrary, her speeches grew even fiercer, her devotion more absolute. She spoke of sacrifice, of giving herself entirely to the people, of being a bridge between them and justice. To her followers, these words carried a prophetic weight, as though she were preparing them for her absence. To her enemies, they sounded like dangerous incantations, stoking devotion into something resembling worship. For in those years, Evita was no longer only a political figure. She had become something closer to a saint, her suffering seen as sacred, her persistence as miraculous. And yet, behind the balcony speeches and the radio broadcasts, there was pain. Nights filled with sleeplessness, mornings with weakness, afternoons where her body trembled. Those who attended her in private recalled her fragility, her moments of exhaustion so deep she could scarcely stand. But when the doors opened, when the cameras appeared, she straightened her back, lifted her chin, and spoke as if nothing were wrong. It was not only defiance, but also devotion, a refusal to let her followers see her diminished. She would be strong for them, even if it destroyed her. We pause here, in the quiet after one of her speeches, the applause still ringing, her smile still fixed, but behind the curtain, her body collapsing into Juan's arms, her breath shallow, her strength spent. Outside, the crowd continues to cheer, unaware of the fragility hidden within. The contrast is haunting, the roar of devotion beyond the walls, and the frailty of a woman who can no longer stand unassisted. And so we close this passage with the image of her stifling a cough behind the applause, her smile steady, her eyes burning, her body betraying her even as her spirit demanded more. The crowd does not see it, the world does not yet know it, but the shadow has fallen, and the candle's flame has begun to tremble in the unseen wind. The cough hidden behind applause lingers like a secret, a shadow that only a few could see, and from that moment onward the struggle could no longer be denied. The illness that had whispered now began to speak more loudly, claiming her strength, bending her frame, draining her once boundless energy. It was cervical cancer, ruthless and unrelenting, a disease that offered no mercy to the young woman who had so defiantly carried herself above poverty and scorn. Yet even as her body faltered, her will did not. To those who gathered in the plazas, she still appeared as Evita, radiant in white, her voice fierce, her hand lifted as though she bore within her the power to banish despair. But behind the curtain, behind the cameras, there was only pain, exhaustion, and the quiet terror of decline. Doctors came and went, their faces composed, their words measured. They spoke of treatments, of possibilities, of interventions that might prolong her life. In Argentina, surgeons attempted what they could, but soon the matter reached beyond the nation's borders. The best specialists were summoned, men whose reputations carried weight across oceans. Some accounts tell of experimental procedures, of radical surgeries, even of radiation attempted in desperate hope. But medicine in the early 1950s was not what it is today. Cervical cancer, once advanced, left little room for escape, and Eva's case was already advanced, her body already worn by the relentless spread. Yet she refused to retreat into silence. With each appearance, she summoned her strength, carried herself with dignity, and delivered words that stirred the poor into tears and devotion. There is something haunting in this image, a woman dying, her flesh failing, yet her voice rising above the crowd like a clarion call. Some said her very frailty made her more beloved, as if she were offering her body itself as sacrifice. The poor saw her thinness, her pallor, and wept, believing she was suffering for their sake, giving her life so that theirs might be honored. In this belief, she became more than political. She became sacred. Juan Perón watched, helpless yet determined. He arranged for her care, surrounded her with doctors, ensured she was never alone. Yet he also allowed her to stand beside him at rallies, to deliver speeches that cost her dearly. Perhaps he understood that to keep her from the public eye would be to diminish not only her but also the movement itself. Or perhaps he could not bear to silence the voice that had carried him so far. Whatever the reason, Eva remained visible, even when visibility meant agony. One of the most striking images from this time shows her at her husband's second inauguration in 1952. She was too weak to stand, too frail to appear before the crowds as she once had, yet she refused to be absent. A platform was constructed upon the car that carried Juan Perón, and upon it a chair was placed for Evita. She sat there, her frame slight, her face pale, her body swaying with weakness, yet she lifted her hand in greeting as the crowds erupted in chants. The people saw not her frailty, but her courage. They saw a woman who, even at the edge of death, refused to abandon them. The devotion deepened into something beyond politics, beyond reason. It became worship. And yet, dear listener, worship cannot heal a body. Each day her pain increased. Each night her sleep was broken by suffering. Nurses and attendants recalled her quiet endurance, her refusal to complain openly, though the struggle was evident. Her frame diminished until her gowns hung loose, her hair thinned, her skin grew almost translucent. The woman who had once embodied vitality now resembled a ghost of herself, yet within her burned a spirit fiercer than before. Her illness became part of her image, inseparable from her myth. To the faithful, her suffering was sanctified, a final offering to the poor she loved. To her enemies, it was proof of her humanity, a reminder that even the most radiant flame must eventually fade. And yet even they could not gloat openly, for her decline was too visible, too tragic, too sacred. In watching her fall, even those who despised her could not escape the weight of mortality reflected in her body. I imagine the quiet of her private rooms during those months, the curtains drawn against the sun, the air heavy with medicines, the faint scent of flowers placed upon her table. Outside, Buenos Aires continued with its noise, its music, its politics. But within those rooms, time slowed, narrowed to the rhythm of her breathing, the murmur of doctors, the whispered prayers of those who served her. Perhaps she lay awake in those nights, listening to the silence, feeling the weakness spread through her body, wondering how much longer she could endure. Did she fear the end, or had she already accepted it? Did she believe she would live forever in memory, that death would not silence her? Such questions linger unanswered, as all intimate questions do. And still she appeared. Still she placed her body upon balconies. Still she raised her voice. Still she kissed the hands of children and blessed the poor who came to her. It was as though she had made a vow never to retreat, never to allow her enemies the satisfaction of seeing her hidden. If her body was failing, then let it fail in public, in service, in devotion. If death was coming, let it come before the eyes of those who loved her, so that her departure would not be a disappearance, but a spectacle of sacrifice. There is an almost unbearable poignancy in imagining her leaning upon Juan's arm, her body trembling, her steps unsteady, yet her gaze fixed upon the crowd that adored her. They chanted her name, their voices rising, tears streaming down their faces. She lifted her hand, and though the gesture was slight, it carried the weight of a lifetime. For in that moment they did not see her illness. They saw only their Evita, their saint, their voice. We end this passage, dear listener, with the image of that frail figure leaning upon her husband's arm, her body fragile, her steps uncertain, yet her eyes burning with devotion. Around her, the chants of Evita, Evita swell into the air, drowning the sound of her shallow breath, concealing the tremor of her limbs. The crowd cannot see her weakness. They see only her strength. But behind the radiance, behind the applause, the shadow deepens, and the candle's flame grows ever more fragile in the wind. Her fragile figure leans upon Juan's arm, her body trembling though her eyes blaze with devotion. And from that fragile image we move into the moment that would become her last great offering to the people. Her final public words, spoken not with the strength of health, but with the fierce determination of one who refuses to surrender. It was June of 1952, the air heavy with the weight of anticipation, as tens of thousands gathered once more in the Plaza de Mayo, their banners raised, their chants rising like waves breaking against the walls of the Casa Rosada. They had come to see her, to hear her, to bear witness, though many already knew in their hearts that her time was drawing near. She appeared before them in white, a color that by then seemed less like fabric and more like a shroud of sanctity. Her frame was slender to the point of fragility, her face pale, her eyes shadowed by illness. Yet when she raised her hand, the crowd erupted as though nothing had changed. Nothing. For in their devotion, they did not see death. They saw a figure who had transcended the limits of flesh, who stood as their champion even while her body betrayed her. She stepped forward, gripping the podium for strength, her fingers thin, her knuckles white. And when she began to speak, her voice trembled but carried, fierce and insistent, as though each word were carved from her very being. She spoke of loyalty, of sacrifice, of the unbreakable bond between herself and the descamisados. She told them she belonged entirely to them, that her life, her body, her spirit, all had been given in service to their dignity. Her words rang like vows, spoken not in the language of politics, but of devotion, as though she were a priestess binding herself to her people in a covenant of suffering and love. The crowd wept openly, men and women alike, their faces lifted toward her as though receiving a blessing. They chanted her name between her phrases, their voices filling the air like a chorus that refused to let her words fall alone. It was not only a speech, it was a farewell. Though she never named death, though she never admitted her weakness, every word carried the weight of finality, the sense that she was speaking not for the present, but for eternity. She promised she would live on in their hearts, that she would never abandon them, that her spirit would remain with them always. The poor believed her, for in their grief they could not imagine life without her. To them she had already become immortal, already something beyond the boundaries of life and death. Juan Perón stood nearby, his face grave, his eyes betraying the depth of his sorrow. He knew, as the doctors knew, as the closest attendants knew, that she was nearing the end. And yet he let her speak, perhaps because he understood that her words were not only for the people, but also for herself, her last chance to declare her devotion, to carve her presence into the fabric of Argentina's memory. He supported her physically, steadying her as her body swayed, but he could not steady the illness that consumed her. All he could do was stand beside her as she gave her final gift. Imagine, dear listener, the sound of her trembling voice carrying across that vast square, amplified by loudspeakers, echoing against the facades of buildings, carried by the wind into the streets beyond. Each word was both fragile and fierce, like the cry of a bird in the moment before flight. The crowd listened with rapture, their chants rising in response, their tears mingling with the dust of the plaza. It was a moment suspended in time, where devotion overcame sorrow, where frailty became strength, where the distance between leader and people dissolved into something resembling communion. Her enemies, too, heard her words, though they did not gather in the plaza. They listened through radios, through reports, through the accounts of others. Some scoffed, dismissing her speech as theater, as manipulation, as nothing more than the last act of an actress. Yet even they, in their bitterness, could not deny the power of the moment. For what other figure could draw such devotion, could turn illness into sanctity, could speak with such authority from the very threshold of death? Their hatred could not diminish the truth. She had bound herself to Argentina in a way no ridicule could erase. When her speech ended, the crowd erupted in chants, a sound so vast it seemed to shake the very stones of the plaza. "Evita! Evita!" they cried again and again as she stepped back, her strength nearly gone, leaning heavily on Juan's arm. For the people, it was not a goodbye, but a renewal of their devotion, a vow that her presence would never fade. But for those close to her, it was unmistakably a farewell, the last time she would stand before them, the last time her voice would carry across the air like a flame in the wind. I imagine the silence that must have followed when she finally left the balcony, carried back into the dim rooms of the Casa Rosada, her body trembling, her breath shallow. Outside, the chant still echoed, but within there was only exhaustion, only the frailty of a woman who had poured out everything she had left. Perhaps she closed her eyes in that moment, not in despair, but in relief, knowing she had spoken her last words to those who mattered most, that she had sealed her covenant with them. There is a strange beauty in such an ending. To speak until the very last breath, to give until nothing remains, to stand before the people one final time and transform death into devotion. Such a moment does not fade with the passing of years. It lingers, suspended in the air of memory, recalled in whispers and in chants, carried forward through generations. Her final speech was not merely heard, it was inscribed upon the soul of Argentina. And so we close this passage with the sound of the crowd's chant, lingering long after her words had faded, echoing into the evening, into the streets, into the very stones of Buenos Aires. Evita, Evita, they cried, voices trembling with both love and sorrow, as the woman who had become their saint withdrew into the shadows, her body failing but her spirit burning brighter than ever. The chants linger in the evening air, echoing down the streets of Buenos Aires long after her trembling voice had fallen silent, and then, slowly, they dissolve into memory. What follows is silence, not the silence of rest, but the silence of inevitability, the hush that comes when even the strongest will can no longer keep the body from surrender. Weeks passed, each day more fragile than the last, until finally on the evening of July 26, 1952, the struggle ended. In a still room in the presidential residence, surrounded by the scent of flowers placed in quiet devotion, Eva Peron drew her final breath. She was only 33. The city seemed to pause, as though struck by an unseen hand. Radios interrupted their music. Voices cracked as they announced the words that so many had feared. Eva Perón has died. Across Buenos Aires, across Argentina, a hush spread, followed swiftly by wails of grief. Women clutched their children and sobbed openly in the streets. Men stood silent with their heads bowed. Candles flickered in windows, and churches, filled with prayers, whispered through tears. The bells tolled, not only in the grand cathedrals, but also in the modest chapels of the barrios, their sound carrying across rooftops and echoing into the night. Imagine that moment, dear listener. The air heavy with July's winter chill, the streets crowded with mourners whose tears misted in the cold air, the soft glow of candles mixing with the shadows of lamplight. Buenos Aires was transformed into a city of mourning, its plazas and avenues filled not with commerce or celebration, but with sorrow. Trains paused, factories fell silent, radios played solemn music. It was as if the machinery of the nation itself had stopped, acknowledging that something immense had ended. Within the residence, the atmosphere was different, quieter, heavier. Juan Perón stood beside her still body, his face unreadable, carrying the grief not only of a husband but also of a leader who knew that something irreplaceable had been lost. For Eva was more than his companion, more than his First Lady. She had been the voice that reached the poor, the fire that animated his politics, the figure who transformed his movement into devotion. Without her, his power would never feel as secure, as beloved, as unshakable. And perhaps, even more painfully, without her, his heart would never feel whole. Attendants moved softly, arranging her body, smoothing her hair, preparing her for the morning to come. The scent of flowers mixed with the faint sharpness of medicines, a reminder that all the efforts of doctors, all the prayers of followers, all the willpower of Evita herself had not been enough to halt the relentless advance of illness. In the end, death is no respecter of power, no respecter of devotion. It comes for all, whether adored or despised, whether wealthy or poor. Yet even in this, Evita was different. Her death was not private, not a quiet departure into obscurity. It was a national moment, a rupture that shook the very soul of Argentina. News spread quickly beyond the capital, in towns and villages, in the far reaches of the Pampas, in places not unlike the Los Toldos where she was born. Families gathered around radios to listen in silence. Some wept openly, others sat motionless, their grief too deep for words. For many, it was as though a mother had died, a protector, a saint who had carried their hopes and their dignity. They draped her photographs with black ribbons. They placed flowers before her portraits. They whispered her name in prayers. It is rare in history for one woman to evoke such mass devotion, rarer still for that devotion to endure beyond life. But grief was not universal. In private salons, in certain homes, in hushed conversations behind closed doors, there was relief. Among the elites who had despised her, who had feared her influence, who had scorned her origins, her death was seen by some as an ending, a lifting of a shadow. They did not celebrate openly, for such a thing would have been dangerous, even obscene. But in whispers, they admitted their sense that the spell had been broken. For them, Evita had always been a figure of disruption, of chaos, of defiance against the old order. Her passing, they hoped, meant a return to balance. Yet even they could not escape the strange emptiness that settled over the nation, the undeniable weight of her absence. In those first hours, her body lay in stillness, guarded by those who adored her. The curtains were drawn, candles burned at her side, and prayers were whispered over her. Outside, crowds gathered, their faces turned upward toward the palace windows, their tears glinting in the lamplight. Some sang softly, hymns mingled with the chants of her name. Others stood in silence, their grief too heavy for sound. The night itself seemed to mourn, its cold air carrying the weight of loss. It is striking, is it not, how 33 years can carry such immensity. She had not lived long. Her life had been brief, intense, hurried, as though she sensed time would not be generous. Yet in those years she had risen from obscurity to the heart of power, from a child in the dust of Los Toldos to a figure mourned by millions. Her life was both improbable and inevitable, filled with contradictions and miracles, and her death only deepened the paradox. For in dying so young, she was frozen in memory, never to grow old, never to fade, forever luminous, forever fragile, forever Evita. The bells tolled through the night, their sound fading and returning, a rhythm of mourning that carried through the city. By morning, Buenos Aires was covered in black crepe and flowers. Long lines formed to pay respects, the people moving slowly carrying candles, photographs, prayers. Some fainted from grief, others collapsed in sobs, unable to bear the weight of her absence. The mourning had begun, vast and overwhelming, and it would not end quickly. But for now, let us remain in that still room on the evening of July 26th. The air is heavy with the fragrance of flowers, the candles burn steadily, and the sound of bells carries faintly through the window. Eva Peron lies motionless, her face serene, her struggle ended. Around her stand those who loved her, their eyes red with tears, their hearts heavy with sorrow. And outside, an entire nation breathes the silence of loss, caught between disbelief and devotion, between grief and memory. We end this passage with the tolling of the bells echoing into the silence of the night, their sound fading into stillness, leaving behind only the weight of absence. The room is quiet, the city hushed, and the woman who was Evita lies still, her story shifting from life into legend. The tolling of the bells fades into the night, their echoes lingering like distant waves, and in that quiet another sound takes their place. The faint scrape of instruments, the rustle of cloth, the hushed movements of men who enter the room where Eva Perón's body lies still. For while the city wept and the nation mourned, within the walls of the presidential residence, another ritual began, one that would turn her death into something uncanny, unsettling, almost unnatural. Her body, which should have been allowed to rest, was instead claimed by science and devotion, transformed into an object of permanence. This was the work of Dr. Pedro Ara, a Spanish physician renowned for his skill in preservation, a man who believed that beauty could be eternal if only decay could be conquered. By Perón's request, Ara was summoned to embalm Evita's body, not with the simple methods of funerary practice, but with a precision bordering on obsession. The goal was not merely to delay decay for a funeral, it was to preserve her forever, to halt the passage of time upon her flesh, to make her body a relic of Argentina. In the quiet of his laboratory, Ara began the meticulous process, each step carried out with devotion and a strange reverence. He opened veins and replaced blood with chemicals, filled her tissues with preservatives, treated her skin until it retained its softness, its texture of life. The scent of formalin and other substances mingled with the fragrance of flowers that still surrounded her, a disquieting blend of death and persistence, of loss and eternity. He worked slowly, methodically, speaking at times as though she could hear him, treating her not as a corpse but as a patient who must be cared for with delicacy. He smoothed her hair, arranged her features, ensured that her face remained serene, her hands soft, her skin luminous. To those who saw the result, it was uncanny. She appeared not dead, but asleep, her expression peaceful, her body unmarked by decay. Visitors gasped, some weeping, some whispering in awe as though confronted not with death, but with miracle. For them, the saint of the poor had not departed. She remained, intact, eternal, a body untouched by time. But there was unease, too. Death is meant to be final, the body meant to return to earth, the spirit to memory. To preserve flesh beyond its natural span is to defy the rhythm of nature, to disturb the boundary between the living and the dead. And so, while many adored the result, others shuddered at it, sensing something unnatural in the preservation. Was this devotion, or was it hubris? Was her body truly being honored, or was it being transformed into an object of power, a symbol too sacred and too strange to be at peace? Perón himself seemed torn between grief and necessity. He allowed Ara to continue his work, perhaps out of love, perhaps out of politics, for he knew how much Evita's presence mattered to the poor. To display her embalmed body was to keep her with them, to assure them she had not abandoned them, to keep alive the devotion that had bound them to the Peronist cause. Yet there must have been moments when he looked upon her still form and felt not reassurance, but unease, the weight of loving a body that no longer lived, yet refused to decay. Dr. Ara, proud of his craftsmanship, later described his work with a strange mixture of artistry and reverence. He spoke of her as the most perfect task he had ever undertaken, as though he were not preserving a body but sculpting a masterpiece. And indeed, there was something sculptural about the result. Evita preserved like a statue of flesh, a relic that blurred the line between human and artifact. To see her was to confront both beauty and horror, devotion and dread. For months, the embalmed body remained in the presidential residence, guarded, adored, visited by those who wept before it. Some knelt as though before a saint, whispering prayers, touching their foreheads to the floor. Others simply stood in silence, their eyes fixed on the face that seemed to belong not to the dead, but to the eternal. The scent of chemicals remained faint in the air, but those who loved her ignored it, preferring to believe she was still with them, still present, still alive in some strange way. And yet, dear listener, one cannot help but ask, what does it mean to preserve flesh beyond death? Does it honor the memory of the beloved, or does it bind them unnaturally to a world they have already left? Was Evita's body kept for love, or for power, or for fear of forgetting? Perhaps all three. Perhaps Perón and Ara and the millions who adored her could not bear to let her go, and so they clung not to her spirit, but to her form, refusing to allow the earth to claim her. But the earth waits patiently, and history shows us that what is denied to time often returns in stranger ways. In the quiet of the embalmer's room, I imagine the faint sound of Ara's instruments, the whisper of cloth, the measured breathing of the man at his work. Outside, the city is alive with mourning, with chants, with processions of grief. But here, in this private space, there is only the strange intimacy of preservation, the eerie act of holding back decay, each stroke of Ara's hand. Each injection of chemical, each smoothing of hair was meant to keep her forever, as she had been, young, beautiful, adored. But in doing so, her humanity was altered. She became something other, something between life and death, saint and statue, woman and relic. And so we close this passage with the image of a gloved hand smoothing her lifeless hair, the faint scent of chemicals lingering in the air, the body of Eva Perón preserved beyond its time. Outside, bells still toll, crowds still mourn, but within, in the quiet laboratory of Dr. Ara, flesh is transformed into eternity, and the woman who was Evita becomes something both more and less than human. The gloved hand smooths her hair in silence, the faint scent of chemicals lingering in the air. And from that still room, her body was carried outward, not to rest, but to be seen, to be mourned, to be transformed into something larger than life itself. For once Dr. Ara's work was done, Evita was no longer only the beloved of Juan Perón, no longer only the First Lady of Argentina. She was a relic, a vision, a body preserved to inspire devotion. And so began her funeral, one of the largest and most extraordinary Argentina had ever witnessed, a mourning that blurred the line between grief and worship. From the moment her death was announced, crowds began to gather, their footsteps echoing across avenues, their arms full of flowers, their voices hushed with sorrow. Black drapes covered the facades of buildings, flags were lowered, and radios played only solemn music. In Buenos Aires, the air was thick with incense, with the fragrance of roses and carnations wilting under the cold of winter. People lined the streets waiting for hours, some fainting from exhaustion, others clutching rosaries, their eyes swollen with tears. For them, this was not only a funeral, it was a pilgrimage, a final chance to see the face of the woman they called their saint. Her body, displayed in its eerie perfection, lay in state at the Ministry of Labor. For days, endless lines stretched for blocks, men, women, and children pressing forward to catch a glimpse. Some knelt and prayed, others touched the glass, others simply stood in silence, their grief too heavy for words. The embalmed face appeared serene, untouched by death, her hair smoothed, her skin soft, her expression as though she merely slept. To those who adored her, it was a miracle. To those who doubted, it was unsettling. Yet whatever one felt, no one could deny the immensity of the devotion. The funeral procession itself was vast, overwhelming, a tide of humanity that filled the streets of the capital. Imagine it, dear listener. black horses pulling a casket draped in flowers, soldiers in solemn march, priests swinging censers heavy with incense, and behind them an ocean of mourners pressing forward, their cries mingling with the tolling of bells. Petals rained down from balconies, banners fluttered with her image, and voices rose in chants of Evita, Evita, as though the sound itself could keep her from fading. The streets were transformed into rivers of flowers and tears, every step an offering, every chant a plea. Yet beneath the devotion lay tension. For even as millions mourned, others watched with unease. The funeral was not only an act of grief, but also of politics. To display her embalmed body, to allow such an immense outpouring, was to strengthen Perón's movement, to remind the poor of their unbreakable bond with Evita, to bind them further to his cause. Some in the military and among the elites muttered that it was dangerous, that it was becoming a cult, that Evita's death was being turned into a weapon as potent as her life. And perhaps they were not wrong. The devotion that filled the streets was so powerful, so overwhelming, that it unsettled those who feared the strength of the masses. There are accounts of mourners who walked barefoot for miles to reach her, of mothers holding infants up toward her casket as if to offer them to her blessing, of men who tore pieces of their clothing to wipe the glass that covered her body. The atmosphere was thick with tears, with chants, with the mingling of despair and ecstasy. For many, it felt less like a funeral than like the canonization of a saint, a moment when death dissolved into eternity. And yet, in the midst of this adoration, soldiers stood guard. Officials watched carefully, for the line between mourning and unrest is always thin. Her funeral mass was held in the cathedral, the air heavy with incense, the choir's voices rising above sobs. Priests spoke of her as a daughter of the church, as a woman who had given her life to the poor. Outside, crowds who could not enter pressed against the doors, listening to the sound of prayers carried outward on the cold air. The cathedral itself seemed too small to contain the grief of a nation. In those moments, it was as though Argentina itself had been gathered into a single body, bowed in mourning, lifted in devotion. Yet not everyone bowed. In private rooms far from the plazas, voices whispered uneasily. Some feared what this cult of Evita would mean for Argentina, how her embalmed body, preserved like a saint's relic, might continue to wield power beyond her death. Others worried that her absence would weaken Perón, that without her voice his connection to the people would falter. Still others, quietly relieved at her passing, felt only disquiet at the sight of millions mourning what they saw as manipulation. But none of these voices could compete with the chants, the tears, the devotion that filled the streets. The days stretched on, the mourning unending. Some wept until their eyes swelled shut. Others fainted in the crush of crowds, yet still they came, as if compelled by something beyond reason. It was not only grief for a woman, it was grief for themselves, for their own struggles, their own wounds, reflected in her life and her death. In mourning Evita, they mourned the poverty they had known, the humiliation they had suffered, the hope she had given them. And in mourning her, they also sanctified her, elevating her beyond the reach of death. I imagine the petals falling upon her casket during the procession, drifting slowly through the cold air, landing softly among tears and prayers. The petals were countless, like snowflakes of devotion, each one a farewell, each one an unanswered prayer. They fell upon the soldiers' boots, upon the black horses, upon the crowd pressing forward until the very streets seemed carpeted with flowers. The scent of roses mixed with incense, with candle wax, with the salt of tears. It was a fragrance of devotion, but also of something unresolved, something uneasy. For beneath the flowers and tears, there remained the troubling fact that her body, preserved, embalmed, displayed, was not at rest. And so we end this passage with that image, petals falling upon her casket, drifting through the air like prayers that have no answer. The crowd weeps, the bells toll, the city is covered in flowers, and yet behind the fragrance and the sorrow there lingers a question. Will she be allowed to rest, or will her body, like her life, be drawn into struggles beyond her control? The petals fall softly upon her casket, drifting like unanswered prayers, and when the last of them has settled, when the chants of the mourners fade into memory, one might think that her journey had ended, that the earth would finally receive her. But Evita was not to be allowed rest. Her embalmed body, preserved in strange perfection, became more than a corpse. It became a symbol too dangerous to be left unguarded, too powerful to be left unclaimed. And so, after Perón's fall from power in 1955, her body entered another chapter, one of shadows and secrecy, of theft and concealment, a journey more disturbing than any she had taken in life. The military coup that overthrew Perón was swift and merciless. His enemies, long held at bay, rose against him, and he fled into exile, leaving behind the Argentina he had sought to command. But in the halls of power he left more than abandoned offices and broken alliances. He left behind the embalmed body of Eva Perón, lying still in its glass coffin, guarded, adored, yet vulnerable. To the new rulers her body was a threat, for they understood what Perón himself had known, that Evita, even in death, could stir the masses, could ignite devotion, could become the rallying cry of resistance. They feared her corpse as though it were alive. They feared the crowds who might gather to her, the chants that might rise once more, the worship that might bind the poor together in defiance. And so, in secrecy, they decided her body must be removed. Not simply buried, for burial would allow pilgrimage, not simply destroyed, for destruction would create martyrdom. Instead, they chose concealment, to make her body vanish into shadows, to erase her presence without declaring it. It was an uneasy compromise, born of fear. And so one night, under cover of darkness, soldiers carried her from the Ministry of Labor. The corridors that had once echoed with prayers and weeping were silent now, filled only with the shuffle of boots, the creak of a casket carried by uneasy hands. Outside, the city slept, unaware that their saint was being stolen, that the body they had adorned with petals was being taken into secrecy. The soldiers themselves were uneasy, for to carry such a relic was not like carrying a corpse. It was to carry a presence, to touch something at once sacred and cursed. Some whispered prayers, others crossed themselves, others refused to look at her face. Her body was moved from place to place, hidden in offices, in warehouses, in secret vaults. Wherever it rested, unease followed. Guards spoke of strange sounds, of lights flickering, of a weight in the air that pressed upon them. Some said they dreamed of her, her eyes opening, her voice whispering in the night. Whether these were real or only the imaginings of guilty men, they reveal the power her preserved form held. She was no longer merely a woman, she was a haunting. At last, fearing discovery, the authorities made a decision. Her body would be removed from Argentina altogether, hidden in a distant land where no pilgrim could find her, no crowd could gather. And so she was placed in a crate, labeled innocuously, as though it contained machinery or documents, and shipped across the sea. The embalmed body of Eva Perón traveled under false names, carried like contraband, concealed from the eyes of the world. It is a strange and unsettling image, a wooden crate aboard a ship, rocking with the waves, holding within it the preserved body of a woman once adored by millions. The ocean carries her now, not the train she once dreamed of in childhood, not the processions of her life, but a hidden voyage into exile after death. She was taken to Italy, to a quiet cemetery in Milan, buried under a false name, Maria Maggi. There, among ordinary graves, the embalmed body of Evita lay in secrecy for nearly 2 decades, visited by no mourners, adorned with no flowers, her name unspoken. Only a few within the military and the church knew where she rested, and they guarded the secret closely, for to reveal it would be to invite unrest. And yet, even hidden, her presence weighed upon Argentina. Rumors spread, whispers of her body stolen, desecrated, destroyed. Some believed she had been taken abroad. Others feared she had been hidden in military vaults. Still others whispered darker tales, that soldiers had abused her, that her body had been defiled. Truth and legend mingled until the boundaries between them dissolved, and Evita became not only a memory but a ghost that haunted the conscience of a nation. Perón, in exile, longed for her body. He knew what it meant, not only to him but to his followers. He pressed for its return, but the military refused, knowing too well the devotion it could ignite. And so, while he lived in Spain, far from Buenos Aires, his wife, embalmed and hidden, lay in silence beneath the soil of Milan, her name erased, her presence concealed. What are we to make of such a journey, dear listener? What does it mean that a body meant to rest was carried like contraband, hidden like treasure, feared like a weapon? Death should bring peace, yet for Evita it brought only exile, as though even the grave could not contain the passions she stirred. Her life had been one of ascent, of defiance, of glory, but her death was one of displacement, of secrecy, of desecration both real and imagined. In this, perhaps, lies the most haunting truth, that power does not end with breath, that memory does not die with flesh, that a body can become both sacred and cursed when it is bound too closely to the hopes of millions. I imagine the locked door of that Milan cemetery, the quiet of the graves around her, the leaves rustling in the Italian wind. The name upon the stone is false, the mourners are absent, the silence is complete. Yet beneath the soil, within the coffin, lies the preserved body of a woman who had once filled plazas with chants, who had once carried the devotion of a nation. The contrast is unsettling. A relic of Argentina hidden in foreign soil, her presence denied, her absence unbearable. And so we close this passage with that image, a sealed crate carried across the sea, locked away in a quiet cemetery under a false name. The petals have fallen, the chants have faded, and the woman once adored by millions lies hidden, her body both preserved and erased, both present and absent, both remembered and denied. The locked door of the Milan cemetery stands silent, the false name carved into the stone concealing more than it reveals, and behind it, beneath the earth, Eva Peron lies embalmed, hidden, erased from her homeland, yet preserved as though waiting. For nearly 2 decades her body remained there, in exile as she had never been in life, her presence unacknowledged, her resting place known only to a few. To the visitors of that cemetery, she was no more than Maria Maggi, another quiet grave among countless others, a name with no history, a stone with no devotion. Yet beneath the soil lay not anonymity, but a relic that had once shaken nations. Back in Argentina, her absence was louder than her presence. Whispers filled the air, stories passed from mouth to mouth. Where was Evita? Some said she had been destroyed, her body burned or discarded in secret. Others said she had been hidden in military vaults, guarded like a treasure. Still others spoke darker rumors, tales that soldiers had desecrated her, that her embalmed form had been abused in secret rituals of hatred. None of these stories could be confirmed, yet each carried weight, for each spoke to a truth deeper than fact. that Evita, even in death, remained a force that unsettled, provoked, haunted. For the poor who had loved her, the silence of her absence was unbearable. They had wept before her embalmed face. They had laid petals at her casket. They had chanted her name through the streets. And now she was gone, vanished, erased. Yet devotion does not vanish with the body. They carried her in memory, in photographs framed with black ribbons, in whispered prayers, in chants that still rose at gatherings. Some even claimed visions, dreams in which Evita appeared to them, dressed in white, blessing them, promising she had not abandoned them. In this way, her myth grew. Her absence, rather than diminishing her, magnified her, turning her into something larger than death itself. Meanwhile, in Milan, her grave lay quiet, visited by no crowds, touched by no flowers. The soil above her shifted with the seasons, snow covering it in winter, leaves falling in autumn, grass sprouting in spring. To passers-by, it was unremarkable, yet those who knew what lay beneath must have felt unease. For to keep such a body hidden was to carry a secret too heavy, a secret that bound even the earth itself to deceit. Perhaps the very silence of that grave was its own kind of haunting. Juan Perón, exiled in Spain, lived with the knowledge of her absence. He longed for her return, not only as a husband who mourned, but as a leader who understood what her presence meant. He pressed quietly for her body, but the military, still fearful, refused, for they knew that if Evita returned to Argentina, even in death, her body could become a rallying point, a shrine for resistance, a banner against their power. And so the years passed, her body in Italy, her memory in Argentina, her presence divided yet undiminished. In these hidden years, legend grew unchecked. Stories of her body multiplied, some grotesque, others reverent. Some claimed her corpse had been paraded in secret, desecrated in acts of cruelty meant to mock her sanctity. Others claimed she had been guarded by soldiers who wept in her presence, who lit candles beside her coffin, as though at an altar. Truth blurred into myth, myth into rumor, until her story became less a history than a tapestry of fears and devotion. And in this, perhaps, lies the most unsettling truth, that Evita had become not only a woman of memory, but a ghost who refused to leave the world of the living. Consider, dear listener, the image of that locked door in Milan, the false name upon the stone. By day, sunlight warms it, children pass by, birds settle upon the branches overhead. By night, shadows deepen, the wind moves through the trees, and the earth grows cold. Beneath, her body lies intact, her hair smoothed, her face serene, her skin preserved by Ara's chemicals. She is neither entirely gone nor entirely present, neither entirely dead nor entirely alive. To rest in such a state is no rest at all. The people of Argentina continued to invoke her. Her portrait appeared in homes, in union halls, in whispered prayers. Some even placed her photograph upon small altars, lighting candles before it, as though she were already canonized. Songs were sung in her honor, plays written, words spoken of her as Santa Evita, a saint of the people, though the church itself never granted her such a name. The myth grew beyond the reach of censors, beyond the reach of exile, beyond even the reach of death. And still, her body lay beneath that false stone, untouched by pilgrims, concealed by secrecy. It is difficult to imagine the unease of those few who knew the truth, who carried the knowledge that Evita's corpse lay in a quiet Milan cemetery under another's name. Did they feel shame, carrying flowers to their own dead, while knowing the beloved of millions lay hidden, unvisited? Did they fear discovery, or did they comfort themselves with the belief that in hiding her they had prevented unrest? Perhaps they felt all of these things, perhaps none, but the weight of the secret endured. Years passed, governments rose and fell, Perón aged in exile, and Evita's myth only deepened. She became a symbol of Argentina's fractured soul, a memory that haunted both those who adored and those who despised her. In the absence of her body, imagination filled the void. She was everywhere and nowhere, present in chance, in dreams, in fears. We end this passage, dear listener, with the image of that locked door in Milan, silent and unmoving, the false name upon the stone, catching the pale light of the moon. Behind it lies a body embalmed beyond its time, hidden from the eyes of those who loved her, concealed from the nation that once wept in the streets for her. The cemetery is quiet, the trees whisper with the wind, and yet beneath the earth a presence endures, unseen, unvisited, restless. The locked door of the Milan cemetery gleams faintly under the pale light of the moon, the false name etched upon its stone, and for many years it remained sealed, holding within its silence a secret too heavy for the earth. But secrets are never eternal, and graves, however well concealed, are never perfectly closed. After 17 years of exile, the still form of Eva Peron was moved once again, the soil disturbed, the coffin raised, and her embalmed body released from its false name. It was not to return to Argentina, not yet. Instead, it was carried to Spain, where Juan Perón waited, old and diminished, his power gone, his body weakened by years of exile, but his longing for her undimmed. And so, in 1971, the strange and unsettling reunion took place, the widower and the preserved corpse of the woman who had once set a nation ablaze. The journey itself was secretive, concealed from the world. She was exhumed in Milan under careful watch, her coffin carried away with the same uneasy reverence that had accompanied her theft years before. Her embalmed body, remarkably intact after all that time, was placed once again in a crate, a vessel for travel, her presence disguised. Across the seas she traveled, not in triumph, not in procession, but in secrecy, her voyage hidden from the millions who had once wept before her. And when she arrived in Madrid, it was not to the chants of the descamisados, but to the quiet halls of Juan Perón's home, a suburban house that smelled of old wood, tobacco, and faded dreams. Imagine that moment, dear listener. Juan Perón aged, his once commanding frame softened by years, his eyes dimmed but still sharp, standing in the half-lit room as the coffin was opened. Before him lay Evita, unchanged, embalmed, her features serene, her hair smoothed, her face untouched by time. For him, it must have been both comfort and torment. Comfort because the woman he had loved was returned to him, her image intact, her body preserved as though awaiting him. Torment because she was still and silent, a relic rather than a companion, a presence that could not speak, could not breathe, could not forgive the years that had passed. They say Perón kept her near, that her body remained in his house, sometimes displayed upon a table, sometimes seated in a chair, sometimes hidden away when visitors came. Candles were lit beside her, flowers placed near her, as though she were both wife and altar. His new wife, Isabel, who had married him in exile, reportedly cared for the body, brushing its hair, tending to it as though maintaining a shrine. It is an image almost unbearable, the embalmed Evita in a suburban home in Spain, surrounded not by crowds but by candlelight, adored in silence, her presence both holy and macabre. What does it mean for love to cling so fiercely to flesh, preserved beyond its time? Was Juan Perón grieving, or was he haunted? Was he honoring her, or was he unable to let her go? Perhaps it was all of these at once. To him, Evita had never been only a wife. She had been his partner in power, the voice that carried him, the flame that made him beloved. Without her, he was diminished, reduced to an old man in exile. With her embalmed form beside him, he could pretend, perhaps, that she had not left him entirely, that the devotion of the people was still within reach. Yet what a terrible pretense to live in the company of death, to light candles before a silence that could never speak back. Accounts of this time are filled with unease. Some who visited the house later spoke of the uncanny presence, of the way the air seemed heavy in her room, of the unsettling sight of her face, lifelike, yet lifeless, untouched by years. For many, it was more ghostly than comforting, more haunting than holy. Yet for Perón and Isabel, it became routine, as though the boundary between life and death had been worn thin by years of devotion and grief. They lived with her, as though she were still part of their household, a silent figure watching over them, both blessing and burden. Outside, Argentina remained restless. The people still whispered of Evita, still invoked her name, still longed for her return. They did not know she was in Spain, resting in exile with Perón. They imagined her in vaults, in secret graves, in places unknown. The mystery only deepened her legend, for absence has a way of magnifying memory. And so, while her embalmed form sat in candlelight in Madrid, her spirit roamed Argentina, in chants, in prayers, in songs sung quietly among workers. Juan Perón aged, but history, as it often does, turned strangely. In 1973, he returned to Argentina, called back by a people weary of instability, their memories of his past reign softened by time. He returned not as a young general, but as an old man, weakened, yet still carrying the aura of power. And with him, eventually, returned Evita. For her body could not remain in Spain forever. Though her return was delayed, though it came only after Perón's own death in 1974, the strange journey she had endured was not yet at its end. But let us remain for now in that dimly lit room in Spain, where Juan Perón, gray-haired and heavy with years, sits before the embalmed body of his young wife. He gazes at her face, unchanged, untouched by time, while his own face bears the marks of decades. In her, time had been halted. In him, it had not. What must he have felt, staring into that eternal youth, that frozen beauty? Was it love or despair or both? Was he comforted or mocked by the sight of her unchanged while he aged? These questions hang like shadows, unanswered, unresolved. There is something profoundly unsettling in this reunion, something both tender and grotesque. Love clings, devotion refuses to yield, yet death does not forgive its silence. To live with the body of the beloved embalmed is to blur the boundaries of grief, to turn mourning into obsession, remembrance into haunting. And yet, perhaps, we should not judge too harshly. For who among us can say how we would endure such loss, how we might cling to what remains when what we love most is gone? And so we close this passage with the image of Juan Perón sitting in silence, a candle burning beside the embalmed body of Evita, her face serene, her hair smoothed, her skin untouched by time. The light flickers, shadows dance across the room, and the old man stares into the face of a woman who has not aged, who has not changed, who remains both near and impossibly distant. Outside, Madrid hums with the ordinary life of the living. Inside, a house becomes a mausoleum, and love becomes a vigil kept beside a silence that will never break. The candle burns beside her embalmed face, its flame trembling in the still air of that quiet Spanish house. And from this vigil of devotion, we pass into darker places, for not all of Evita's posthumous journey was attended with reverence. Around her body, like shadows circling a flame, rumors gathered, rumors of desecration and insult, of soldiers who, fearing her even in death, sought to reduce her sanctity by acts of cruelty. Whether these stories were truth, invention, or something in between, they spread like smoke across Argentina, filling the silence of her absence with tales too grotesque to ignore. Some whispered that when the military first seized her embalmed body after Perón's fall, it had been subjected to indignities at the hands of those who despised her. They spoke of soldiers treating her corpse without respect, of her coffin being mishandled, of her presence mocked in secret. Others whispered darker still, stories of abuse, of profanation, of her sanctified figure defiled in ways too disturbing to name aloud. These tales, whispered in kitchens and on street corners, carried no clear source, no certain evidence, yet they lingered in the air with the weight of possibility. For those who adored her, the thought was unbearable, but it was believed, because it fit too easily into the truth of their fear, that even in death, Evita was not safe from her enemies. Why do such rumors arise, dear listener? Why do we speak of desecration when faced with sanctity? Perhaps because the sacred, left unguarded, tempts not only reverence but also violation. To those who hated her, her embalmed body was not a relic but an affront, a reminder of a woman who had humiliated them, who had defied them, who had dared to elevate the poor. To strike against her corpse would be, in their eyes, to strike against the myth she had become, to mock her sanctity and diminish her power. And so, whether the acts truly occurred or were born of imagination, the stories persist, part of the darker legend that enfolded her after death. Dr. Ara himself, the man who had embalmed her, once spoke of his fears during those years, fears that his work might be undone, that his masterpiece might be defiled. He had crafted her body with meticulous care, with reverence that blurred the boundary between science and devotion, and to imagine his work desecrated was, for him, like imagining a cathedral torn down. Yet he too admitted that the stories were difficult to separate from truth, that secrecy had allowed rumor to thrive, that shadows breed monsters when light is absent. For the poor, the rumors only deepened her sanctity. If her body had been abused, it only proved her sacrifice, only confirmed that she had been persecuted even beyond death. In their eyes, she was a martyr twice over, first in her life of struggle and illness, and again in the indignities visited upon her corpse. The more terrible the rumors, the greater the devotion grew. They lit candles not only for the Evita they remembered in life, but also for the Evita they imagined suffering in death, a figure who had endured humiliation for their sake. In this way, desecration, whether real or invented, fed sanctification. And yet there is something profoundly unsettling in these tales. To imagine her embalmed body, lifelike yet lifeless, treated not with reverence but with cruelty, is to confront the fragile boundary between honor and violation. To imagine soldiers standing before her, mocking, laughing, or worse, is to feel the chill of history at its darkest. We cannot say with certainty how much of it is true, but in a sense, the truth of the acts matters less than the truth of the belief. For in history, rumor can shape memory as surely as fact, and Evita's memory was forever shadowed by the possibility of desecration. Her body, after its hidden years in Italy and its vigil in Spain, had become not only a relic, but a contested symbol. To some, it was holy. To others, it was dangerous. To some, it was to be revered. To others, to be diminished. In this contest, the stories of abuse became weapons, either to strengthen devotion or to justify contempt. And thus, her corpse, like her life, was caught in the endless struggle of politics and passion, its sanctity both defended and denied. Juan Perón, in his candlelit vigil, must have known some of these stories, must have heard the whispers. Did he believe them? Did he shudder at the thought of what might have been done to the body he now kept beside him? Or did he push the rumors aside, preferring to imagine her as untouched, unspoiled, her embalmed face as serene as when he first gazed upon it? We cannot know, but the rumors hung in the air, inescapable, reminders that even death could not shield her from the passions she inspired. There is a question here that lingers, dear listener, a question that cannot be answered but only asked. What becomes of the sacred when the sacred is left unguarded? Does sanctity endure, untouchable, even in the face of desecration? Or is the sacred itself fragile, dependent upon the reverence of others, vulnerable to mockery, to insult, to abuse? In Evita's story, both answers seem true. Her body may have been treated with cruelty, yet her sanctity endured, even grew, magnified by the very rumors of violation. Desecration, rather than diminishing her, seemed only to make her more untouchable in the hearts of those who adored her. But still, the image disturbs. A relic is meant to rest in peace, to be revered, to be visited by pilgrims who bring flowers and prayers. Evita's embalmed body was denied this, hidden, carried, whispered about, and perhaps mishandled in ways we may never know. Her sanctity was affirmed not by stillness, but by struggle, not by peace, but by conflict. And in this, perhaps, lies the essence of her story, that nothing about Evita was ever simple, ever serene. Even in death, she was contested, loved and hated, adored and reviled, sanctified and profaned. We end this passage with the question itself left hanging in the air, unanswered, unresolved. What becomes of the sacred when the sacred is left unguarded? The candles burn low, the rumors echo, the embalmed body lies in its silence, and history itself seems unable to decide whether she was protected or desecrated. The question lingers in the air, unresolved, heavy as a shadow. What becomes of the sacred when the sacred is left unguarded? And from this silence of doubt, her journey moves once more, for secrets cannot endure forever, and bodies cannot remain endlessly displaced. After years of concealment, of whispers and candlelit vigils in exile, Eva Peron was finally returned to the land of her birth. Yet her return was not triumphant, not accompanied by the great processions of flowers and chants that had followed her funeral. It was quiet, cautious, arranged in secrecy, and it ended not in the open plazas but deep within the earth, behind walls of stone and steel. At last she was laid to rest in Buenos Aires, interred in a vault designed not for peace but for protection, a resting place that was as much fortress as grave. It was 1976 when her body was placed in the Duarte family tomb in the Recoleta Cemetery, a place of marble mausoleums and grand memorials where Argentina's elite had buried their dead for generations. The irony is striking. The woman despised by many of those elites in life, mocked for her origins, now lay among them in death, her name inscribed in bronze upon the family vault. Yet even here, her presence was not ordinary. While other graves stood vulnerable to time, Evita's resting place was reinforced, fortified, designed to withstand intrusion. Beneath layers of steel and cement, her coffin was lowered, so deep within the earth that it could not easily be stolen again. Imagine the sound of it, dear listener, the scrape of stone, the clank of chains, the coffin descending slowly into the crypt. Around it the air was hushed, the ceremony restrained, for her burial was not meant to stir great crowds. There were no oceans of petals, no chants filling the air, no processions of barefoot mourners. Instead, there was silence, heavy and careful, as though the act of burial was less about honoring her and more about containing her. And then came the sound that lingers, the heavy thud of earth and stone falling onto steel, sealing her away from the world above. Was this peace, or was it imprisonment? Did the vault offer her rest, or did it lock her away as though the living still feared her even in death? Perhaps both, for Argentina was by then a land unsettled, gripped by dictatorship, haunted by violence and fear. The rulers who permitted her return did so, not out of devotion but calculation, seeking to settle the ghost of Evita by burying her deeply, to quiet the whispers by sealing her away. Yet devotion cannot be buried by stone, nor silenced by steel. The poor still remembered, still invoked her, still carried her face in their prayers. And so even as her body lay behind locked doors, her spirit roamed free, uncontainable. The Recoleta Cemetery itself is a place of paradox. By day it is visited by tourists and mourners, its avenues of mausoleums echoing with footsteps, its marble statues gazing down in silence. By night it is a place of shadows, the wind moving through iron gates, the whisper of leaves brushing against stone. To walk there is to feel the weight of history pressing upon you, each name another story, each tomb another silence. And within it, beneath layers of earth and steel, lies Evita, deeper than any other, her resting place more guarded than that of generals or presidents. The poor, when they came, could not always reach her. The Recoleta Cemetery belonged to the wealthy, its gates not easily open to the descamisados who had once filled the plazas for her. And yet some found their way, pressing flowers against the bronze plaque that bore her family's name, whispering prayers, leaving notes, weeping quietly in the shadows of marble angels. For them, it mattered little that her body was buried deep, that they could not touch her coffin, that they could not see her embalmed face. What mattered was that she had returned, that she lay once more in Argentine soil, that she was home. But even in her homecoming, there was unease. For how do you bury a myth? How do you enter a presence that has grown larger than death? Her vault was sealed, her body hidden, yet her memory continued to move in the world above, in songs, in whispers, in the devotion of the poor. Some said her body had at last found peace. Others said she was imprisoned still, locked away because the living feared her power. Both visions seemed true, for the vault was both grave and fortress, both sanctuary and prison, both ending and continuation. There is an image here that lingers. The heavy doors of the Duarte tomb closing, the echo of stone against stone, the key turning in the lock. Outside, the cemetery falls silent, its avenues dim, the statues gazing down as though indifferent. Inside, deep beneath, Evita lies in her coffin, preserved beyond her years, surrounded by steel and stone. The sound of earth falling has ceased, the ritual completed, and yet the silence that follows is not peace, but suspension, as though even now the story is not finished, and perhaps it never will be. For some, her burial was a resolution, a final act that returned her to the earth. For others, it was another chapter in the strangeness of her journey, another transformation in the legend of Evita. In sealing her body, they did not seal her presence. In hiding her away, they did not diminish her power. She remains in the chants of the poor, in the prayers whispered in quiet kitchens, in the photographs that still hang on walls. The vault holds her body, but it does not hold her. Let us end this passage, dear listener, with the sound of that heavy earth falling on steel, echoing in the darkness of the crypt. The noise fades, leaving only silence, a silence deeper than the graves around her. The vault is sealed, the key turned, and above ground the cemetery stands still, its marble facades catching the faint light of dawn. Yet in that silence, in that darkness, something endures, an unrest, a presence, a story not yet concluded. The silence of the sealed crypt lingers, the sound of earth upon steel echoing faintly in the mind, and from that silence rises something that cannot be buried, the creation of myth. For though Eva Peron's body was hidden deep beneath marble and iron, her presence only grew larger, spreading beyond the confines of her tomb into the imagination of a nation. In life, she'd been adored and despised, a figure of flesh and blood whose voice carried over plazas. In death, she became something else, something uncontainable. Saint, icon, symbol, legend. Her face, frozen in youth, began to appear not only in photographs preserved by the poor, but in murals painted on crumbling walls, in banners unfurled at protests, in prayers whispered at night by mothers rocking their children. She had become, at last, not simply a woman, but a myth woven into the fabric of Argentina. It is often so with those who die young, especially those who die radiant, adored, and contested. Death halts the passage of time, leaving the image untouched, unaged, untarnished. At 33, Evita became eternal, forever youthful, forever luminous, forever frozen in the height of her devotion. The woman who had coughed behind applause, who had suffered in silence, who had walked with fragile steps upon balconies, faded from memory. What endured was the Evita of devotion, the radiant figure in white, the hand lifted in blessing, the voice trembling yet fierce as she spoke her last vows to the poor. Among the descamisados, she was not remembered as a politician's wife, but as a mother, a sister, a saint. They called her Santa Evita, the little saint of the poor, though the church never canonized her. In their homes, her portrait hung beside images of the Virgin, her face illuminated by candles, her presence invoked in whispered prayers for health, for work, for dignity. She became a figure of intercession, one who had lived their struggles and who now, beyond death, might still hear their pleas. In the barrios, in the kitchens, in the quiet of the night, her name was spoken, not in speeches, but in murmurs of faith. For the poor, her myth was a source of comfort, but for the powerful, it remained a source of unease. The military rulers who had stolen her body feared even her image, feared the chants that rose when her name was spoken, feared the gatherings that invoked her memory. To them she was still dangerous, even as a myth, for myths cannot be imprisoned, cannot be silenced, cannot be buried under stone. They tried to erase her, to ban her name, to forbid her songs, but erasure only strengthened the devotion. The forbidden becomes sacred, and the silenced name becomes louder in whispers. The myth of Evita spread beyond Argentina, carried by exiles, by writers, by artists who saw in her story a parable of power and fragility. She was portrayed in novels, in plays, in songs, her life retold with embellishment, her death described with reverence or unease. To some, she was the embodiment of compassion, to others, the warning of demagoguery, to still others, a tragic heroine consumed by illness and ambition. Each vision reflected more about the teller than about the woman herself, and in this multiplicity, she became truly mythic, a mirror upon which countless faces could be projected. There is an image that captures this transformation, a mural painted upon a wall in a poor neighborhood, her face rendered in broad strokes, her hair shining like a halo, her eyes lifted toward the horizon. Below, words of devotion are scrawled. Evita vive, Evita lives. Children play beneath the mural, their laughter rising into the air, their lives shaped by struggles not unlike those Evita once knew. To them, the mural is more than paint. It is a promise that she has not abandoned them, that she remains among them, watching, blessing, guiding. Yet myth is not only comfort, it is also ambiguity. For myths are pliable, claimed by many, shaped into whatever form is needed. To Peronists, she was the eternal flame of their movement, proof of their devotion to the poor. To the poor themselves, she was a mother who had never ceased to care. To others, she became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how charisma can become cult, how devotion can blur into worship, how power can sanctify even what is human. And in this ambiguity lies the enduring fascination. Evita is never one thing. She is always many, always contested, always elusive. In the years after her burial, her name returned more openly to public life. Songs were sung once more, plays were staged, stories retold. Writers described her not only in reverence but in doubt, questioning her motives, her strategies, her ambitions. Yet even the most critical accounts could not erase her power, for to write of her at all was to acknowledge her presence. She had become inseparable from Argentina itself, part of its identity, its memory, its soul. The myth carried an almost religious quality. Processions were held in her honor, anniversaries marked with flowers and chants. Even those born after her death spoke of her as though they had known her, as though her voice still lingered in the air of Buenos Aires. To them, she was both history and eternity, a figure who had transcended the boundaries of time. The chants of Evita, Evita still rose, not with the urgency of politics, but with the reverence of prayer. And yet, dear listener, what is a myth but a story, told again and again, shaped by those who tell it? The true woman, the Eva Duarte who grew up in Los Toldos, who boarded a train to Buenos Aires with little more than determination, who struggled as an actress, who loved, who suffered, who died too young, she becomes harder to find amid the layers of myth. She is covered by petals, by chants, by rumors, by prayers, and perhaps that is her fate, to be forever both real and unreal, both flesh and legend. Let us linger in this moment in a barrio at dusk where the mural of her face catches the fading light and children's laughter echoes in the streets. A woman lights a candle before her portrait, whispering a prayer for her family. A man hums an old song that recalls her name, and above them painted eyes gaze out from the wall, serene, eternal, untouchable. The myth endures, not in grand processions, but in these quiet acts of remembrance, these whispers in the shadows, these flickers of devotion that refuse to fade. We end this passage with the image of her face upon a mural, gazing outward as the evening falls, the sound of whispered prayers mingling with the laughter of children. Her body lies deep beneath stone and steel, but her presence lives upon the walls, upon the lips of the poor, upon the very air of Argentina. The mural gazes outward into the evening, its painted eyes serene beneath the fading light, and the whispers of prayer mingle with children's laughter as dusk settles over the barrio. From this quiet moment we move into reflection, for here the story of Eva Perón draws toward its end, though her presence never truly concludes. Beneath stone and steel she lies in her family tomb, preserved and hidden, while above the earth her myth continues, woven into memory, into devotion, into the very identity of Argentina. She is both saint and specter, adored and reviled, remembered and distorted, her image luminous, yet shadowed by contradiction. And so we must pause, dear listener, to ask what it means for a life to endure beyond its natural span, what it means for death to give birth not to silence, but to legend. Her duality remains unresolvable. To the poor, she is forever the little saint, the woman who lifted them from invisibility, who listened to their petitions, who placed shoes on children's feet and medicines in the hands of the sick. To them, her suffering was sanctity, her illness a sacrifice, her death a martyrdom. In their prayers, she is not gone but alive, interceding still, guiding still, blessing still. But to her enemies she remains the opportunist, the demagogue, the actress who turned politics into theater, the manipulator who bound a nation in devotion to her image. Even in death they whisper her name with disdain, unwilling to grant her the purity of myth, determined to remember her flaws. Both visions live side by side, neither silenced, neither victorious. And perhaps that is why her story endures. For it is in contradiction that myth finds its strength. Were she only saint, her memory might fade into hagiography, distant and untouchable. Were she only opportunist, she might be dismissed, forgotten in the passing of years. But because she was both, compassionate and ambitious, luminous and shadowed, adored and hated, her memory holds the complexity of life itself, and so it continues to speak, continues to stir, continues to haunt. Her image lives in murals, in songs, in prayers. It lives in the history books, in the plays and novels that retell her life with embellishment or critique. It lives in the memories of those who stood in the Plaza de Mayo and heard her trembling voice declare her devotion. It lives in the hearts of those who whisper her name at night, seeking comfort in her story. And it lives, too, in the unease of those who despised her, who cannot rid themselves of her presence, who know that hatred is itself a form of remembrance. There is a strange immortality in such a legacy. The body, however preserved, will one day fade. The steel and stone that guard it will one day crumble, but the story will remain. The myth will continue to shift, retold in different voices, reshaped for different times, invoked for different purposes. Already her name has been used to bless and to condemn, to sanctify and to caution. Already she has been invoked as both savior and warning, both flame and shadow, and so she will remain forever adaptable, forever elusive, forever present. I often wonder, dear listener, what she herself would think of this. Would she have embraced her sanctification, smiling to know that the poor still pray to her decades after her death? Would she have bristled at the distortions, at the rumors, at the way her story has been twisted to fit the needs of others? Would she have longed simply to be remembered as she was, a woman who rose from nothing, who loved fiercely, who suffered terribly, who died too young? We cannot know. For once myth takes hold, the individual is no longer entirely theirs. The story belongs to the world, to those who tell it, to those who believe it, to those who doubt it. And yet, within all the layers of myth and memory, perhaps there remains a kernel of truth. A young girl standing on the edge of the pampas, watching the train tracks stretch toward Buenos Aires, her eyes full of longing, her heart restless with ambition. That girl boarded a train with little more than determination, and from that act of courage came everything that followed: the rise, the adoration, the hatred, the illness, the embalming, the exile, the return, the myth. Perhaps in remembering her in this way, as a child who dared to dream, we come closest to the truth behind the legend. Let us return, then, to her final resting place. Deep beneath the marble facades of the Recoleta Cemetery, behind doors of steel and layers of earth, her body lies preserved. Above, the cemetery is quiet. The statues of angels gaze with blank eyes. The avenues are lined with tombs of generals and presidents. Tourists pass, their footsteps echoing on stone, their voices hushed by the weight of history. Some pause before the Duarte vault, laying flowers, touching the plaque, whispering her name. For them, it is not only a grave but a shrine, not only a tomb but a doorway into memory. And so we close this long journey with an image, a woman of 33 years, forever young, forever luminous, forever haunting. She stands on balconies, her hand raised in blessing, her voice trembling yet fierce. She lies in coffins, embalmed beyond decay, carried across seas, hidden in graves. She appears in murals, her face serene, her eyes gazing into the horizon. She lingers in whispers, in prayers, in rumors, in songs. She is adored, she is reviled, she is remembered, she is distorted. She is Evita, both saint and specter, both flesh and myth. And the question remains, dear listener, echoing in the silence after all the chants and prayers. Do we ever truly bury the dead, or do they continue to walk with us in memory, in devotion, in fear? Perhaps the answer lies not in her tomb, but in the way her story endures, not in the silence of the crypt, but in the voices that still speak her name. For though the earth has claimed her body, memory refuses to let her go.